Demorningly discharged me, my husband was not there. I had been in the hospital for 6 days. 6 days after what my surgeon called a textbook appendectomy turned into anything but an infection, a second procedure, a fever that spiked to 104 on day 3, and had a night nurse pressing a cold cloth to my forehead at 2 in the morning while I called out for someone who wasn't coming. The someone being my husband Derek, who had kissed my cheek on day 1, told me I was in good hands and driven my Range Rover back home to our Scottsdale house, where he had apparently spent the better part of 6 days doing everything except visiting his wife. I want to be fair. He came twice. The first time was the day of the surgery, before they took me back. He held my hand in the pre-op area and said all the right things, and I remember thinking, this is the man I married. This is the man I chose. The second visit was day 2, about 45 minutes, during which he ate my graham crackers, scrolled through his phone, told me the guest bathroom faucet was making a noise, and asked if I knew the plumber's number. I did not know the plumber's number. He left shortly after. On days 3, 4, 5, and 6, my father sat in the recliner chair beside my bed. My father is not a warm man by most people's definition. He is 61 years old, built like someone who spent his 20s in a warehouse and his 30s behind a boardroom table, which is exactly what happened. He built a logistics company from a single truck and a borrowed phone number into something that now moves freight across 14 states. He does not hug easily. He says, "good" instead of "I love you" when you tell him something went well. But he drove 2 hours from Tucson the night my fever spiked, and he did not leave until I was standing on my own 2 feet. And somewhere in those 4 days of him reading the newspaper in that chair and bringing me terrible vending machine soup, and never once saying a word about Derek's absence, I understood something I had been avoiding understanding for a long time. Derek called on day 5. I remember because my father had stepped out to take a call of his own, and I was alone when the phone buzzed on the tray table. "How are you feeling?" Derek asked. "Better," I said. "They think I can go home tomorrow." "That's great, babe. Really great." A pause. In the background I could hear something. Music, voices, the particular ambient blur of a restaurant or a bar. "Hey, so I'm at Hendrix right now, with some people from the office. Colton's leaving, remember? His going away thing. I figured since you're getting better, you're at a going away party. It's a Tuesday. It's not like it's a big thing. Just drinks." I looked at the IV still threaded into the back of my hand. I looked at the whiteboard on the wall across from my bed, where a nurse named Gloria had written my name, and her name and the date, and a small smiley face because she said it helped patients feel more human. I thought about the night 3 days ago when I had been genuinely frightened, when the fever had climbed and my body had felt like something foreign, and my father had been the one sitting in the dark beside me telling me in his quiet, flat voice that I was going to be fine. "Okay," I said. "You're not upset?" "No," I said. "I'm not upset." I wasn't. Or rather, I was past it already, past the point where upset was the right word for what I felt. What I felt was something quieter and more settled, like a door closing softly instead of slamming. The next morning, the hospital arranged for a car service. This was standard, they explained. Many patients didn't have someone available to drive them. I sat in the back of the sedan in a pair of Derek's sweatpants that my father had brought from home because I hadn't packed for 6 days. And my father sat beside me, and neither of us said anything for a while. He wasn't there, my father said anything for a while. He wasn't a question. He had a work thing. My father looked out the window. The desert was bright and flat and indifferent. "Rachel," he said. "I know. Do you?" I had met Derek at 29, which felt late enough that I should have known better, and young enough that I gave myself permission not to. He was charming in the way that men who have never had to try very hard are charming, effortlessly, carelessly, with just enough self-awareness to seem humble about it. He worked in commercial real estate, or he had worked in commercial real estate, until the market shifted 2 years into our marriage and the position disappeared, and he pivoted, his word, into consulting, which from what I could tell meant working from home, attending occasional lunches, and managing a portfolio of excuses for why the invoices hadn't gone out yet. My father had never said a word against him. Not once, directly. But I had noticed things. The way my father's eyes went still when Derek talked about his deals. The way he asked questions that sounded polite but weren't. Specific questions, the kind you ask when you want to see if someone's story holds together. My father had grown a company. He knew when numbers didn't add up. I had chosen not to notice my father's noticing. We had a prenuptial agreement. This was my father's condition before the wedding, stated plainly over dinner at his house in Tucson, with Derek sitting across the table looking like someone had changed the channel without warning. My father had slid a folder across the table and said, "I'm not suggesting anything about your intentions. I'm protecting my daughter." These are the terms. Derek had been gracious about it, which was the right move, and he'd signed, and I'd been relieved and slightly guilty and had pushed it to the back of my mind, the way you push things you don't want to examine. The prenup was clean. What was mine before the marriage, the house, the trust fund my mother had set up before she passed, the shares in my father's company that had transferred to me at 25, remained mine. What we earned together was joint. What was his was his. It was simple and fair, and Derek had agreed to all of it. What Derek had not told me at any point in 4 years of marriage was that he had been transferring money, slowly, methodically, in amounts small enough not to trigger alerts, from our joint account into a separate account I didn't know existed, held under a name I had never heard, at a bank 2 states away. I didn't know this yet. I knew it 6 days later, because of a phone call I made from my childhood bedroom in my father's house in Tucson, where I had gone to recover because the alternative was recovering in Scottsdale and my own house with my husband, and I was not ready for that. My father had hired a financial forensics consultant 2 months earlier. He told me this on day 3 of my stay, setting a mug of coffee on the nightstand beside me, with the same expression he'd used to tell me my soccer team lost a game when I was 9, matter of fact, like the information needed to be given but didn't need to be dramatized. 2 months, I said. I had concerns. You didn't tell me. I didn't have anything to tell you yet. I had concerns. He sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, the cactus in the front yard threw a long thin shadow across the gravel. I have something to tell you now. The consultant's name was Patricia, and she had 20 years of experience and a voice like a tax attorney, which she once had been. My father put her on speakerphone and she walked me through it the way you explain something technical to someone who is smart but not a specialist. Clearly without condescension, pausing when I needed to absorb. The account had been opened 14 months ago. The transfers began at $800 once a month, then increased gradually as nothing triggered and no one noticed. The total as of the most recent statement was just under $62,000. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed and looked at my hands. "Is this legal?" I asked. "Transfers from a joint account technically require joint ownership of the funds," Patricia said. "The structure of your prenuptial agreement complicates his claim to a portion of that account, combined with the fact that the receiving account was opened under a falsified business name, and I can walk you through that documentation. We're looking at potential wire fraud and possibly theft by deception. That determination would be up to a prosecutor, not me, but I can tell you what the paper trail shows. He opened the account under a fake business name," I said. "An LLC registered in Nevada to an address that does not exist. Yes, I thought about the night in the hospital when the fever was high and I had been frightened, and Derek had been at home, and I thought about the graham crackers and the plumber's number and the going-away party, and all the small moments I had cataloged and filed away without understanding what I was cataloging." "What do I do?" I said. It wasn't quite a question. My father picked up his phone and called his attorney. His attorney's name was Martin, and he had handled my father's business affairs for 19 years, and he was in our living room by 4 o'clock that afternoon with 2 associates and the leather briefcase and the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for a specific kind of call and is satisfied it finally came. He sat across from me at my father's dining room table, and he did not waste time. "Here is what we can do," Martin said, "and here is what we should do. Those are 2 different lists, and I want you to understand the difference before we decide anything." I understood the difference. I told him to tell me both. The first list involved the joint accounts, the house, the legal exposure from the fraudulent LLC, and the grounds for divorce in the state of Arizona. Martin explained each item in the same tone he might use to describe a business acquisition. Not cold exactly, but precise. The second list was shorter and involved what he called strategic sequencing. The order in which things happened mattered, because if Derek learned about the fraud investigation before the financial accounts were frozen, there was a risk he would move the money again. How long? I asked. To freeze the joint assets? 24 hours once we file. The separate account, the Nevada account, that's a law enforcement matter, and it moves differently. But we can ensure he cannot access the joint funds as of tomorrow morning. I thought about Derek in our house in Scottsdale. I thought about him sitting on the couch I had picked out, watching the television mounted on the wall I had paid for, drinking something from the refrigerator we had bought together with money that had mostly come from me. I thought about him thinking that I was in Tucson recovering, that I was weak and grateful to be out of the hospital and not yet in a state to ask questions. Do it, I said. Martin nodded once and opened the briefcase. I called Derek that evening. My father sat in the chair by the fireplace reading a newspaper, and I understood he was there in case I needed him and was giving me privacy in the way he knew how to give it, present but quiet. Derek answered on the second ring, cheerful in the way he was always cheerful when he didn't know anything was wrong. Hey, how are you feeling? Getting some rest? I'm better, I said. The recovery is going well. I think I'll be home by the weekend. Perfect. The house is good, everything's good. I had the faucet looked at, by the way. Wasn't a big deal. Good, I said. You sound tired. I am tired. I just wanted to hear your voice. This was not entirely untrue. I did want to hear his voice. This was not entirely untrue. I did want to hear his voice. I wanted to hear it and understand it the way you understand something in retrospect. The thing that was always there, that you now know the shape of. Get some sleep, he said. I'll see you this weekend. You will, I said. I didn't sleep well that night, but it wasn't from grief exactly. It was from something that felt more like the particular exhaustion of carrying a weight you've been told you can finally set down. The setting down itself takes adjustment. I lay in my old bedroom with the same curtains my mother had hung 20 years ago. And I thought about the shape of my life before Derek and the shape of it during Derek, and tried to imagine the shape of it after. And for the first time in a long time, that shape felt possible. My father knocked on the door at 7 in the morning. He didn't come in, just knocked and said, Martin called. It's done. The accounts were frozen by 9. Martin had moved methodically and cleanly, the way my father had always moved when something important needed to be done. No drama, no announcement, just the careful execution of prepared steps. The joint checking, the joint savings, the investment account we had opened together 3 years ago that Derek had contributed to exactly once. All of it locked, pending the divorce proceedings and the fraud investigation. Derek discovered this at 11:15 when he tried to use the card at a restaurant in Scottsdale. He called me 4 times. I let the calls go to voicemail. Then he called my father. My father answered because my father always answers. He believes in direct conversation, even the difficult kind. And I sat at the kitchen table and listened to one side of the exchange while my father stood at the counter with his coffee. I'm aware, my father said at one point, in the tone he used when people said things that didn't require a response. That's not a decision I made, he said a moment later. That's a decision your financial records made. A longer pause. I could hear Derek's voice from where I was sitting, elevated, the particular register of someone who is frightened and expressing it as anger. She'll call you when she's ready, my father said. You should call your own attorney. And then he ended the call and set the phone down on the counter and looked at me. He doesn't know about Nevada yet, he said. What will happen when he does? That's between him and the DA's office. My father picked up his coffee. That's not your problem. It was strange what I felt in those days. People imagine that the unraveling of a marriage feels like devastation, and perhaps for some it does. Perhaps it should, But what I'd felt for a long time already was a kind of low, constant sadness that I had grown so accustomed to, I mistook it for my own personality. The sadness of being in a room with someone and feeling alone. The sadness of calling someone from a hospital bed and hearing a bar in the background. The sadness of knowing something is wrong and choosing, again and again, not to name it, because naming it would require doing something about it. What I felt now was closer to air. My sister called on day 5. Her name is Joanna, and she lives in Portland, and she has been married for 12 years, to a man who, the first time she was in the hospital, just a minor procedure, nothing serious, took 3 days off work to be there. And when I called her the night of my fever, she had cried and said, "I'm coming," and I had talked her out of it. She knew things about my marriage I hadn't told anyone else, and she had never said the thing she knew, because she understood that saying it was my job. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I think I actually am," I said. "Dad told me some of it." "How much?" "Enough." A pause. "Rachel, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry." "I'm not. You're allowed to be sad about it, I know." And there was, in a way, sad for the version of myself who had believed something and been wrong. Sad for the early years when I thought I was building something real. But grief and regret are not the same as devastation. And I'd been quietly grieving this marriage for longer than I could easily date. "I think I've been sad about it for a while," I said. "I just didn't call it that." Joanna cried a little on the phone, which was right. Joanna cries for the things I don't. We were always divided that way. I told her I'd come to Portland once. Things settled, and I meant it. Martin filed the divorce petition 11 days after I came home from the hospital. Derek had retained an attorney, as my father had suggested, and the attorney was competent but working with limited material. The prenup was tight, the forensic record of the transfers was unambiguous, and the LLC documentation was in the hands of people who did not care about Derek's explanations for it. I never asked Martin for a detailed account of how it unfolded on Derek's side. I didn't need to know. I needed to know the things that affected me, and those came in clean numbered updates from Martin's office, delivered with a precision I was grateful for. The house was mine by the terms of the prenup. Derek moved out in October, taking what was his, which was less than he had expected. The Range Rover, my car purchased with my money before we were married, stayed in the garage. Martin had made that point clearly and early, and Derek's attorney had not disputed it once the documentation was provided. The Nevada account investigation took longer. Patricia testified. I provided records. I was asked questions I answered carefully and honestly, and Martin sat beside me through all of it, quiet and useful in the way of someone who has been doing this exact thing for a very long time. I won't describe the outcome in detail because it doesn't belong to me to describe, it belongs to the process that handled it, and the process handled it. What I will say is this. My mother died when I was 19. She died in October, in a hospital not unlike the one I had just left, and my father had sat beside her bed for the last 6 days of her life, the way he sat beside mine, reading, bringing coffee, being present in the particular way that does not make noise or draw attention, but fills a room. He had loved her in the way people love when love is not a feeling they perform but a thing they simply do, consistently in small repeated actions across decades. I had watched him do it, and I had thought I understood it, and I had made choices that showed me I did not yet. I understood it now. One evening in November, I drove out to Tucson for dinner. My father made the pasta dish he had been making since I was 12, which involves canned tomatoes and an amount of garlic that would be alarming to most people. And we ate at the kitchen table with the back door open because the desert in November is the best version of itself, cool and clean and quiet. "I have a question," I said. He looked up. "When did you actually hire Patricia?" A pause. He picked up his fork. "March. Of this year, yes. I had been in the hospital in September. He had hired a financial forensics consultant 6 months before that." "What were you seeing?" I asked. Questions I couldn't answer, numbers that felt wrong. He set the fork down. "I didn't want to say anything to you until I was sure. I've never been the kind of father who tells his daughter who to be with. You know that." "I know, But I'm also not the kind of father who watches something happen and does nothing. I thought about that for a while. I thought about all the versions of protection, the ones that announce themselves and the ones that work quietly in the background, in March, before anything is broken yet, just in case. Thank you, I said. He picked up his fork again. Good pasta tonight, he said, which from him, with everything. I am 33 now. I live in the Scottsdale house, which I've repainted and rearranged and made mine in the ways it always legally was, but did not always feel like. I have a dog named Frank who is large and opinionated and takes up most of the couch, which I allow because it is my couch and I can allow whatever I like. I am back at work. I manage operations for a branch of my father's company, a job I took 2 years into the marriage when I needed something that was wholly my own, and which I am better at than I expected and find more satisfying than I can easily explain to people who think logistics is boring. My sister came to visit in December, and we stayed up until 2 a.m. talking in the kitchen the way we hadn't done since we were in our 20s. And she said at one point, "You seem different," and I said, "Different how?" And she thought about it for a moment and said, "Lighter. Like you put something down." I had put something down. That was the right way to describe it. I have thought about what I would say to a younger version of myself, the one who was 29 and charmed and willing to overlook the things that should have been looked at squarely. I don't know that I would say, don't do it, because the years of a life are not only their ending, and there were good things in those years, real things. But I think I would say this: pay attention to what people do when it costs them something, not when it's easy. When it costs them time, convenience, comfort, the option of being somewhere else, that's the information. Everything else is just weather. The man who sat in a hospital chair for 4 days when he could have been home did not do it because it was convenient. He did it because I was his daughter, and I was sick, and there was no other option that existed for him. I have known this about my father my entire life, and I am only now understanding the full weight of it. There is a version of this story that is about betrayal, and it is true. There is a version that is about money, and that is also true. But the version I come back to is the smaller, quieter one, the one about a room at 2 a.m. and a fever that scared me, and the sound of someone turning a newspaper page in the dark, so I would know I wasn't alone. That is the part I carry forward. That is the part that made the rest of it possible. I talked to Joanna last week. She and her husband are coming down in the spring, and my father is driving up from Tucson, and we are going to have dinner in the backyard where the desert puts on its best performance in April. Warm and golden, the cactus blooming the way they only bloom for a few weeks a year, the whole landscape briefly and extravagantly alive. Frank will be there, taking up space as he does. There will be too much of my father's garlic pasta. I thought I knew what a good life looks like. I'm finding out I was only partly right, and that's okay. Partly right is somewhere to start.